his computer. All right, welcome back, class of Economics 1070 to our course. This is the principal lecture that I'm going to be posting for the week of March 6th. I'm with Rajiv Sethi. Rajiv is a professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University. He's a distinguished economist, well-published, and as you know, he is co-author of the book Shadows of Doubt, which investigates the role of stereotypes in crime and policing in the United States. Rajiv has kindly agreed, and I can't thank him enough, to make this presentation in lieu of him being physically present here at Brown University to talk about his work. So I'm going to turn the discussion over to Rajiv, who will be sharing his screen with us and walking us through a presentation that he's developed of this material. I will post this presentation with his permission at the course website shortly after the video has been uploaded. So without further ado, I give you Rajiv Sethi.
Thanks, Glenn. I will start by sharing my screen, which you have disabled. So you need
to... this has happened before, and I think I know what I need to do. Manage participants. I need to do something about managing the participants. And so sorry. Oh, here it is, and here you are. And more. Make co-host.
That'll work.
All right, I've done that. I have to give the approval of it, and it should now be enabled.
Okay, good. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you tell me if you can see it?
I can see it very well. Crime and Punishment in the Shadows of Doubt.
Okay, great. So I just mentioned a couple of things to start. One, as you said, this is based on joint work with Dan O'Flaherty, as contained in our book, and I'll cover some aspects of our argument.
May I tell you, Rajiv, excuse me for interrupting, that I've asked the students to read the introduction and chapter 1 on stereotypes and chapter 7 on police use of force from the book. I have not asked them to read anything further, but they have access to the book. So if you want to suggest further reading, feel free to do so.
I'll do that. And so some of what I'll talk about is contained in the chapters that you've assigned. And then there's other material I'll discuss, which is in other chapters. But I'll only be able to cover part of our argument, and for the rest of it, I refer your students to the book. Okay. The other thing I'll say is that I presented essentially what I'm going to say to your class at the Santa Fe Institute community lecture a couple of months ago. And there's a YouTube video of that too, if they want to look. And I'll give information about that at the end of the talk. So those are two other resources. Okay, so I'd like to start off with a passage from a wonderful book by Elizabeth Anderson. And I'm just going to read it out and then discuss it. And she's describing an incident that happened at night in Detroit in 2007. She says, one late night in 2007, I was driving in Detroit when my oil light came on. I pulled into the nearest gas station to investigate when a young black man approached me to offer help. Don't worry, I'm not here to rob you, he said, holding up his hands, palms flat at his level, gesturing his innocence. Do you need some help with your car? I thanked him for his offer and told him I wasn't sure how much oil I needed. He read the dipstick, told me the car needed 2 quarts, and offered to do the job for free. From the look on his face when I paid him anyway, it was clear that he needed the cash. So there's a lot going on here, and I think this illustrates, I think, the approach that we take in the book and try to untangle some of the things that are present in this situation. And the point I want to emphasize is that there's a lot of uncertainty here. So uncertainty on the part of Elizabeth Anderson about the motives of the person approaching her, uncertainty in his mind about her fear of his motives, and her uncertainty about how to interpret his actions in light of his uncertainty about her. So there are hierarchies of beliefs here, where people think something about somebody else, but they're also contemplating what that person thinks about them, and so on and so forth, up the chain of beliefs. And we don't know, Elizabeth Anderson doesn't say whether she was afraid of the young man, but the young man obviously thought that she may be. And he went through a fairly elaborate ritual to try to put her at ease, which worked. It may or may not have been necessary, but it worked. And they were able to transact with each other in a way that was mutually beneficial over here. And so you have beliefs and beliefs about beliefs, and even beliefs about beliefs about beliefs. And sometimes they can be navigated by all kinds of rituals or signals. And sometimes they can't, and sometimes they break down. And that's really the kind of thing that we explore in the book. And we do it with particular attention to what this implies about crime and criminal justice in the United States. So that's by way of prelude.
Very good.
And really, one of the things that's salient over here is the issue of stereotypes. So whether or not Elizabeth Anderson stereotyped this individual in any way, he certainly contemplated the possibility that she did stereotype him and tried to shift his stereotypes through some action on his part. So let's begin really by talking about what we mean by stereotypes. Okay. Before I do that, let me just mention that these kinds of uncertainties hang over interactions related to crime and the criminal justice system, very widely. It's very hard to think of situations in which they don't apply or aren't implicated in some way. They apply in the case of personal crimes when you think about victims and offenders, for instance, in the case of a robbery, in the case of an escalating dispute that may or may not end up in homicide, stereotypes are going to come into play. Certainly they come into play in stops and searches by police because these stops and searches are meant to be based on a legal standard called reasonable suspicion, and suspicion itself can be affected by stereotypes. They come into play in the case of police homicides, which may or may not be warranted in any given situation. But again, the legal standard is that the police officer must fear that either his own life or the life of others is at risk. And those fears, again, can be affected by stereotypes. Stereotypes can affect witness cooperation. And here you get stereotypes about the behavior of other witnesses. So if you get a whole bunch of people witnessing something, it really matters whether these people believe that others are going to come forward and corroborate their testimony. Because if they do, then the chances of conviction are higher, the chances of retaliation are lower, and in general, you can end up with the witness being relatively safe. And if they don't, coming forward alone can be very dangerous for a witness. And we'll see some examples with regard to crimes in which the witness and the victim are the same person, in the case of rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment even, where these stereotypes can come into play. Stereotypes come into play in bail decisions because judges are meant, in many jurisdictions, they are meant to release people on their own recognizance based on an assessment about their likelihood of showing up at their court-appointed date. And this too can be affected by stereotypes. And certainly they affect jury deliberations. And there are some cases discussed in the book where the beliefs about the guilt or innocence, and here the standard is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, what's a reasonable doubt? That too can be affected by stereotypes.
Let me ask a question, if I may.
Please do.
Because I'm wondering if that's not a question in the mind of some of the others who may be viewing this lecture, which is Elizabeth Anderson. In your example, you and I know her. She is white. She's a very distinguished philosopher at the University of Michigan. And on a street at a certain hour in the evening, she is approached by a young Black man of whom she may or may not be fearful.
Yeah.
Now, suppose she were fearful. A, would that be an irrational fear on her part? And B, is it something about which we should have a normative judgment, a critical judgment of her for harboring such a fear? What do you say about that?
So my answer to the first question, is it a rational fear, is that it may or may not be. In fact, it may, in some situations, be irrational for her not to fear. If you mean by rational a sort of a reasoned statistical, a reasoned response to statistical regularities that one knows about or is aware of, then certainly stereotypes can be rational or not rational. There can be situations in which they are warranted and others where they are not warranted, based simply on the evidence that people are given. But what we are doing in this book is to trace out the effects of these stereotypes. So the analysis, to use the economic dichotomy, is positive rather than normative for the most part, which is, these stereotypes exist. Sometimes they are exaggerated, sometimes they are not, sometimes they're statistically accurate, and sometimes they're far from accurate. But they have implications. They have implications that one can trace out, especially when people stereotype about stereotypes, when people imagine the stereotypes that other people hold, and that this has implications for people's actions. And those implications are useful to think about and understand if you want to understand the reality that we face, especially with regard to crime and criminal justice. So that's the approach that's taken in the book. Now, the normative point is, I'll get to, but even if a stereotype is accurate, and you might make the argument that people may stereotype certain people to be possessing contraband in the context of a police search. Maybe their beliefs about the likelihood of discovering contraband are accurate. Some people argue that they are, some argue that they are not. Even so, those people who are targeted, who belong to the group that are targeted but are entirely innocent, and that may be the majority of the people who are actually targeted, incur a welfare loss, especially if they feel that they're targeted on the grounds of their race or ethnicity. And the question then becomes that even if the stereotype is rational, is it then rational to act on it? And that's a different question. And that's a normative judgment. And I think one can, in certain cases, make the case that even if one believes that something is true and does so, based on a reasonable parsing of the statistical evidence, one ought not to act on it in some ways relative to others. So I'll get to this point. But
if I belabor this, please just move on. But I just want to push this a little bit. If I have a poor credit score and I go to the bank to borrow money, the bank may decline to lend me the money, or may lend me the money only at a higher interest rate.
Yeah,
that's a kind of stereotyping. It may be that I'm perfectly creditworthy, but just happen to have a poor score.
Yeah.
If I have a criminal history of violence and it comes time for the parole board to decide whether or not to allow me to go free, they may make a different judgment in my case than if I didn't have a criminal history. And that's a kind of stereotyping, is it not? Lumping me in with all people of this criminal history, even though my particular case may be different from theirs, and I'd be judged in that way. Can it be that all such discriminations based on stereotyping are problematic, or how do we draw the line?
So if the judgment is based on your credit score, that's an individual judgment based on an individual characteristic, not your membership of some group. And if people of different groups are treated the same based on conditional on the credit score, then I would say that that's normatively permissible. Suppose your credit score was not known, but it was believed that people in the groups to which you belong, in a social identity group, tend to have low credit scores, and you were denied on that basis. That's a very different kind of action that has different consequences. And that should be judged.
So you're not saying the credit score use is not in itself a kind of stereotype. It's just not the kind of stereotype that you're talking about.
That's right. That's right. The credit score doesn't tell you everything that you need to know, but what it tells you is based on an individual's history rather than, or in individual circumstances, rather than the circumstances to a group to which you have assigned that individual.
It's based on the circumstances of the group of people who, like myself, have that particular history.
Right. So let me define stereotypes, and then maybe some of this will become clearer. Yeah. Okay. So what do we mean by stereotypes? So it's a belief about an individual based on characteristics of a group to which they're perceived to belong. And notice that this is, you can think of people with low credit scores as a group. You can think of it that way, but really what's going on here is that if you don't know what you really need to know, and you assign to that person a credit score based on your beliefs about the group to which they belong, then we would say that we are stereotyping. And as I said, this stereotype may be accurate or inaccurate, right? It may be based on ethnicity, it may be based on gender, religion, it may be based on somebody's accent, tattoos, piercings, any kind of visible marker that allows you to assign somebody to a group. It arises all over the place. My focus will be on crime and criminal justice, but it arises, for example, with taxi drivers and riders. You know, at least in the pre-Uber days, you know, you had many stories of taxi drivers, you know, driving past some individuals to pick up others. And they may have done so on the basis of stereotypes about the likelihood of the tip, the likely destination, the length of the ride, the likelihood of being robbed, and so on. So that's where a stereotype would come into play. People who are dining in restaurants may have waiters who stereotype, again, with regard to how well good service would be rewarded, and they may you know, treat different diners differently based on that stereotype. If a patient says to a doctor, on a scale of 1 to 10, my pain level is a 6, how is the doctor to interpret that? It's quite possible that depending on whether the patient is male or female, black or white, you know, Latino, non-Latino, they may assign a different meaning to the 6, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10 than they do for a different patient, and that would be a stereotype. In the case of a teacher and student, somebody turns into your course, Glenn, somebody turns in an absolutely outstanding paper. You contemplate the possibility that it may be plagiarized. How much likelihood do you give to that scenario? Do you think that it's just a brilliant student who's done an amazing job and a lot of hard work? Or do you think that they've just taken it off the internet or paid somebody else to write it? That may be based on stereotypes that you hold. So this is the
I sure hope not.
Right. I'm just raising, I hope not, that's my hope too, but right. I'm just raising the possibility that this can happen and does happen from time to time. So stereotypes, as I said in the introduction, can affect behavior directly as well as indirectly. Certainly, if you stereotype somebody, that's gonna affect your behavior. But the most subtle effects are second order with regard to beliefs. So those who expect to be stereotyped may avoid some interactions where the stereotype would have a negative consequence for them, or indeed they may seek out certain interactions in which they believe that they're stereotyped in a manner that is favorable to them. So it affects not just people who stereotype, but people who expect to be stereotyped. And that's going to play an important role in my argument. Now here's a riddle. This is taken from a book, and I'll give the citation in a second. But here's a riddle that your students in your class would very likely have come across already, because it's quite well known. It was in a movie from the 1990s, and it's been in several publications. But I'd like your class to just think about how they reacted to this riddle when they first saw it. So let me just read this out again. So a father and his son are in a car accident. The father dies at the scene, and the son, badly injured, is rushed to the hospital. In the operating room, the surgeon looks at the boy and says, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son." And I've tried this with students in various classes. And this is taken from the book you see on the slide here, Blind Spot by Mazreen Banerjee and Anthony Greenwald. And I've tried this with a bunch of classes, and for people seeing it for the first time, it's often the case that they think along the following lines. So one possibility is that they're stumped, they think, can't figure out a reasonable answer to this riddle. Another possibility is they think about a same-sex couple, that maybe, the doctor, the surgeon and the dad who died at the scene were both fathers, both dads for this kid. Others think about, adoptive versus biological fathers, but the picture that they have in mind is often, one where this kid happens to have two dads. Now, going back to your question about statistical accuracy, if one were to think about just the data, this, a Bayesian, what we in economics call, a Bayesian inference,
yeah,
based on the distribution of characteristics in the population, the statistically accurate response to this riddle, or the most likely answer, is that the surgeon is the boy's mom. And this, it doesn't have the kind of salience that the statistical regularities in society would insist that it have if we were really fully Bayesian in our reasoning. So this riddle reflects, at least for some people, the property that they can't bring to mind. It's just not salient, even though it may well be statistically accurate. They have a certain idea of what it means to be a surgeon, and that doesn't map onto it, the surgeon in this case being the boy's mom. And I've had this, I have to say, from pre-med students who are women and who are quite distressed at the fact that they didn't solve the riddle in that way. And so it happens. It's not that they are somehow incapable of imagining. It's just that it doesn't come to mind. So you know, our mind can do this to us. That's the point of this riddle. Okay, so so a couple of quick examples. So you know, you've had situations of physicians on planes, and this is one quite famous story about a Houston physician, Tamika Cross, who tried to help out a passenger, a man who was sitting 2 rows in front of her, who became unresponsive, and was told by the flight attendant, "Oh no, sweetie, put your hand down. You know, we're looking for actual physicians or nurses or some type of medical personnel. We don't have time to talk to you." And when this was posted, she posted it on her Facebook account. It was featured in the Washington Post, and a whole bunch of people came forward, not just Black women, but you know, white women and Asian women who were physicians who reported having very similar experiences. And so she didn't fit the part really at that time in that situation, not necessarily because the flight attendant was malicious or hateful or in any way, or wished her harm, but because it didn't come to mind that this person, you know, was qualified to help. Now, why do we stereotype? So you know, this is a question that psychologists have addressed, you know, for 100 years or so. And Jerome Bruner, in a really nice paper that was published in Conference Proceedings 1957, you know, he describes, the paper is called, I think, Going Beyond the Information Given. And it's a lovely way to describe the process, the mental process that's going on over here. We get some information, we need more, and we go beyond the information given in some way. We extrapolate or fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps. And he argues that stereotypes involve equivalence grouping, and it's part of the cognitive machinery that allows us to deal with novelty in daily life. And he says, you know, if we were to respond to each event as unique and learn anew about what to do about it, we'd be swamped by the complexity of our environment. We just wouldn't be able to cope. You know, if we had to check each chair to see if it's going to hold up weight, you know, if we actually approached every single action that we took without generalizing from past experience in the way that stereotypes compel us to do, we'd be paralyzed essentially. That's the point Bruner's making. And even earlier, 1922, this wonderful book, which I really recommend that your students read, by Walter Lippmann, called Public Opinion. It's such a beautifully written book, and I'll quote a couple of times from this before I'm done. You know, he says, were there no practical uniformities in the environment, there'd be no economy and only error in the human habit of accepting foresight for sight. So this is a nice way to describe what we do when we stereotype. We accept foresight for sight. But he says there are uniformities sufficiently accurate, the need of economizing attention so inevitable, that the abandonment of all stereotypes for a wholly innocent approach to experience would impoverish human life. And Walter Lippmann, as I'm sure you know, is the person who coined the term stereotype. And this was the book in which it was done. And the idea was to try to generate this, you know, as an analogy to a photograph or a picture in the mind. And you know, this was where the term stereotype comes from, and it's really beautifully expressed what's going on over there. But this relates to your point about statistical accuracy. It may or may not be, but it's a cognitive necessity regardless. You know, we may be accurate, we may be highly inaccurate, but we can't stop doing it, you know, and the question is really, what should we do about the fact that we can't stop doing it, no matter who we are? And I'll come back to that right at the end of the talk. So the problem that arises, and then goes back to your point about statistical accuracy. So once a stereotype is in place, and this is Gordon Allport's classic book, The Nature of Prejudice, and you know, he argues, and others have argued, that once a stereotype is in place, it affects the way in which we parse new evidence. And if it confirms the stereotype, we accept the evidence more readily than if it disconfirms. And this is what psychologists refer to as confirmatory bias. And it can cause stereotypes to become entrenched, and it can cause heterogeneity in beliefs to be persistent. Even people, you know, who start off with different beliefs facing the same evidence may process that evidence in very different ways. They may even, in fact, there's work in economics which suggests they may even move further apart, even facing the same evidence. Their beliefs may actually diverge rather than converge. And again, let's go back to Lippmann, because he describes it so beautifully. He says, for the most part, we do not first see and then define. We define first and then see. What is alien will be rejected. What is different will fall upon unseeing eyes. For when a system of stereotypes is well fixed, our attention is called to those facts which support it and divert it from those which contradict. Exactly the same point I think that Allport is making. So going back now to Stereotypes of Criminality, and I'll mention here a book that you have frequently mentioned. In fact, I may even have heard about it first from you. And this is Khalil Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness. I think it's an extremely important book. And
you should know that we've encountered the book here in this course. We've read a couple of chapters early on from the book.
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic book, and he really tries to point out that associations of Blackness with criminality really began to take shape and get entrenched and deepened after the 1890 census, and the public interpretations of the data in that census. And he also points out that many groups, actually, Italians and Irish in particular, who had these associations of criminality in the public mind, but that they faded away over time, that they diminished and got detached from the rest of the group identity, whereas it has been entrenched and does not seem to have shown signs of diminishing with regard to associations of Black men in particular.
Let me just interject that we did read in Muhammad of the work of Frederick Hoffman, the demographer quantitative demographer who used the 1890 census as a foundation for his book, Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro.
Yeah.
The title of which perfectly captures this thing that you're talking about, the traits and tendencies of the American Negro, taking millions of people and categorizing them in that way. But,
it's an embodiment of an essentialist view rather than trying to understand the data in non-essentialist terms. Now, your book, I'm sure your students have come across and you have assigned your Du Bois lectures.
I have indeed, the Anatomy of Racial Inequality.
And the discussion at the beginning about essentialist and non-essentialist interpretations of the data that we see is a very important distinction. And if I understood right, you were arguing that it is possible to understand a wide variety of phenomena in non-essentialist terms, but our tendency is to reach for the simplest explanations, which are often essentialist. And this is an example that you just gave of pure essentialist reasoning, and there are many of those in Khalil's book, Professor Muhammad's book, that they are that essentialist reasoning was rampant at that time. Maybe less so now, but remains very relevant, not just in our society, but in many societies. But I want to point out to your students an example that I find completely fascinating, and this is about how stereotypes have changed over time. And this is an example from Mississippi in the 1890s. So after Black men were given the right to vote, post Civil War, many states, particularly in the South, tried to reverse that decision in ways that they thought were constitutionally permissible and that were in fact constitutionally permissible. By basically engaging in what we today call, felony disenfranchisement. So basically what they did is to try to classify people in a non-racial way, but in a way that was highly correlated with race, so that they could say that one category of person was denied the right to vote, whereas another was permitted, without making it explicitly race contingent, but by design implicitly race contingent. And so what Mississippi did in the 1890s is that they decided that people who are convicted of burglary, theft, arson, and obtaining money under false pretenses should be disqualified from voting, while robbery, murder, and other crimes in which violence was the principal ingredient were not. And this is very strange from today's perspective, right? Because today we think of, robbery and murder and violent crimes as being more justifiably used for disqualifications from voting. It's hard for us to imagine why anybody would allow a murderer to vote when they're excluding somebody who commits fraud, which is what Mississippi actually did and was permitted to do under the Constitution at that time. And they have explicit rationale for this, and the explicit rationale for this is very revealing. So, this is from a Mississippi Supreme Court ruling, I think in 1896, and it's discussed by Randall Kennedy in his wonderful book, Race, Crime, and the Law. And he says, and he quotes from, this is from a quotation from a Mississippi Supreme Court ruling, which states that, African Americans are a patient, docile people, but careless, landless, and migratory within narrow limits. Without forethought, its criminal members given rather to furtive offenses than to the robust crimes of the whites. and so, there was a stereotype. There was a stereotype at that time that, if you're going to commit murder, you're probably going to be white, because that's not the kind of robust crime that a Black American would commit. Fraud, on the other hand, is. So let's make fraud a disqualification from voting, and let's allow murderers to vote. So the stereotype, changed, but it's been it's been a part of criminal justice discourse for a very long time.
All right, this example is striking for a number of reasons. One, in the association of violent crimes with whites, not blacks, which is contrary to our current sensibility. But the other thing that strikes me here is it may be that the crime committed by blacks are construed as furtive in virtue of the fact that they're being committed by blacks. And the crimes committed by whites are taken to be robust precisely because it's whites who are doing them. I mean, I wonder if it wouldn't be a robust offense to commit fraud or burglary were the people doing it white people.
That's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. The way in which we label activities is conditioned by whether we want to cast them in a positive light or not.
That's it.
And this rather, you're right. This is not something that I had, previously thought of when looking at this example. But what we consider today to be a heinous crime, murder or a very violent crime, robbery, with very negative connotations and associations, is being given a bit of a positive spin here by describing it as robust, and that's being done in part because of the racial character of the offenders. It's fascinating. Yes. That's an interesting point that had not previously occurred to me. Yeah. So as you said, this is not consistent with our current sensibilities. So I want to just point out now. You'll keep track of time, right, Glenn? You're going to tell me.
Yes, we have about, I'd say, 50 minutes, 50.
Yeah. So I'll stop whenever you ask me, but you can give me warnings from time to time.
Fine.
So you said just a moment ago that the association of violent crimes with whites is not consistent with our current sensibilities. And here's an example. So this is actually from the 1990s, but this is taken from the memoir of Brent Staples, who's a writer for the New York Times, but also a psychologist by training. So he has a PhD in psychology from University of Chicago, place that you know very well. And in the 1990s, he would walk, I think, along the lake, and found that people were very fearful of him. And here again, I'm going to read from a passage from his memoir. He says, I became an expert in the language of fear. Couples locked arms and reached for each other's hand when they saw me. Some crossed to the other side of the street. People who were carrying on conversations went mute and stared straight ahead, as though avoiding my eyes would save them. So people were fearful of him, and this disturbed him. And he tried to avoid this. So he tried to be innocuous, but didn't know how. I began to avoid people. I turned out of my way into side streets to spare them the sense that they were being stalked. It disturbed him to have people afraid of him when he himself knew that there was absolutely no reason for them to be. Then he says, out of nervousness, I began to whistle and discovered I was good at it. My whistle was pure and sweet and also in tune. On the street at night, I whistled popular tunes from the Beatles and Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The tension drained from people's bodies when they heard me. A few even smiled as they passed me in the dark. Now, he was able to switch he was able to switch the stereotype or shift the stereotype by engaging in this activity. And this expression, whistling Vivaldi, has become very famous, actually. And as you know, it was chosen by Claude Steele as a title of his book for describing some of his pioneering research on stereotype threat. And it shows you really how stereotypes can indeed be shifted by relatively tangential or what would seem to be quite minor changes in disposition or changes in behavior. But the reason I'm the reason I'm presenting this example here is to show you that to point out that he got sick of this. So this was costly for him. There was a psychological burden to putting other people at ease, and this has been described by many people. Paul Butler, for example, in his book Chokehold, just describes just how day after day, just trying to put people at ease is a burden. It takes its toll on you psychologically. So what happened with Brent Staples, and this is a much less well-known passage in the same book, is that he decided to act in stereotype confirming ways. And so let's continue. And this is later in the book. So he says, one night I stooped beneath the branches and came up on the other side, just as a couple was stepping from their car into their townhouse. The woman pulled her purse close with one hand and reached for her husband with the other. The two of them stood frozen as I bore down on them. I felt a surge of power. These people were mine. I could do with them as I wished. If I'd been younger with less to lose, I'd have robbed them and it would have been easy. All I'd have to do was stand silently before them until they surrendered their money. And this is much less well known because it paints him in a less favorable light, I guess, in the eyes of some. But it's understandable, it's psychologically understandable, the reaction. But the lesson here, as far as understanding crime, criminal justice in the United States is concerned, is that if people are terrified of you to this extent and you know it, there are going to be certain activities that are relatively easy and simple and lucrative for you to perform. For example, if you intended on acquiring the property of others, and there are 4 of the major crimes, what are called index crimes in the United States, they're part of the FBI Uniform Crime Reports, which collects data from agencies throughout the country. Those crimes are, burglary, robbery, motor vehicle theft, and larceny. And it's important to understand the distinction. So the definition of robbery involves the use or threat of force. So you have to, put the victim in fear.
Yeah.
And that's part of the threat of robbery. If you leave your laptop unattended in the library and it's gone, that's theft or larceny. If your car is stolen while you're asleep, it's parked on the street, that's motor vehicle theft. But if the car is taken, while you're stopped at a light, that's carjacking, and that is a robbery. A mugging is a robbery. If somebody takes your laptop from you physically on the street, that's a robbery. And those are very different crimes. And the point here is that if you're going to take somebody's property and people are afraid of you, robbery will be more lucrative than burglary, motor vehicle theft, and larceny. It'll be easier to perform. Whereas if people are not afraid of you, they'll tell you to get lost. They will not respond to your demand for their money or for their possessions cooperatively. You're better off going and committing other crimes. So this is the first point I want to make. I'll come back to this in a second. So as I said, crimes motivated by the acquisition of property, robbery, burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, only robbery has the property that it involves face-to-face interactions. It's the only one where stereotypes could even come into play. Burglary, often you don't even know you've been burgled, for a week if you've been away on vacation, for instance. Same with motor vehicle theft, you'll find out later. Larceny, you may find out soon enough, but there's no contact typically between victim and offender in the case of larceny. The definition of robbery, as I said, is, it involves taking something of value from somebody by force or threat of force or violence and or putting the victim in fear. So stereotypes are going to affect victim compliance. If somebody's afraid of you, as Brent Staples, illustrated in that passage, they're going to hand off their money without a fuss. And if you stereotype them as being afraid of you, if you stereotype them as having stereotypes about you that cause them to be fearful, it's going to affect your decisions with regard to victim selection. in much the same way as your students are going to choose their occupations based on what they can perform well and they can find lucrative. You know, somebody who's a criminal offender is facing also these kinds of decisions. And one of the most important decisions they'll face is victim selection. And they're going to select victims based on their beliefs about the fear that the victim will have of them if they're planning to conduct a robbery. And so stereotypes are going to affect both selection among crimes of appropriation and selection among potential victims of those crimes, if you decide that you're going to commit robbery. And you know, this is really how Dan and I started working in this area, is by looking at, you know, data. And I'll show you some of this data. This is more recent than, of course, than we looked at initially, but this is the most recent data available with regard to robbery. This tells you the victim race, that is self-reported victim race or ethnicity, and the perceived race of the offender on the part of the victim. And you see on the top left there that the largest sort of category of robbery under this classification, with about 40% of robberies being of this type, involves a white victim who perceives the offender also as being white. So there's a lot of white on white robbery, which is not surprising because whites are a majority of the US population. But the striking difference here is that, you know, robberies with white offenders and black victims are practically non-existent. In fact, this is from the National Crime Victimization Survey. In some years, you know, the count of white on black robberies is literally zero. Over this period, it's 1%. Whereas if you look at robberies where the offender race as perceived by the victim is black, they are much more equal opportunity. They're much more evenly spread among victim groups. So you have roughly the same amount of black on white robberies as you do with black on black robberies. Black offenders do not avoid black victims to the same degree as white offenders avoid black victims. And if you look at the ratios over here, you see 14-to-1 ratio of black on white versus white on black robbery. And that's based on rounding. If you don't round, you'll see a 17-to-1 ratio. It's even larger than that. So you know, you get this huge asymmetry. And part of what we think is driving it is that, you know, black offenders in this case are going to believe that the white victims are fearful of them in ways that will make robbery easier. Whereas white offenders are avoiding black victims precisely because they don't expect them to be fearful and would not hand over their money without a fuss.
So the story here is about offender behavior, is it? It's that white offenders don't choose black victims.
The story is here about offender behavior in victim selection based on offender beliefs about victim behavior, should they choose that particular victim. Correct. So that's the hypothesis I'm advancing to explain these facts. But there's a more important set of data that I'd like to emphasize. I'll get to that in a second, but you can see with regard to arrest rate. So this is selection across crimes.
Yeah.
You see a much higher incidence. This is African-American share of total arrests for these 4 crimes of appropriation. And you see this big difference where robbery is an outlier compared to the other crimes, motor vehicle theft, burglary, and larceny. If you're white and you're going to take somebody's property, these crimes. If you're black and you're going to choose to take somebody's property, you're going to choose robbery, at least at the margin. And that's borne out at least with this data. Now, that's not a proof of any kind. It's just suggestive evidence that I'm presenting to you.
Yeah.
But this really matters. This really matters with regard to public perceptions of criminality. So going back to Khalil Muhammad's point about, you know, how we associate criminal tendencies with particular groups of people. This is based on what we see. What we see are the folks who are arrested. What we see are the folks whose faces are plastered on walls. What we see are the people who are incarcerated in prisons. And it is a fact, and you know, one doesn't need to think very hard to understand why this exists, but it is certainly a fact that committing motor vehicle theft or burglary or larceny is going to get you arrested and in jail with much lower frequency than committing robbery. And there are fairly obvious reasons for this. Robbery, you know, you can report it right away. You have, you know, you can provide a description of the offender to the police officer, for example, and so it's not surprising that you get higher rates of arrest and prison admission for those who commit robbery relative to these other crimes. But if you keep in mind the fact that, you know, so let me just go through this data. This is from Stephen Raphael and Michael Stoll. Let me actually put the point out the book, Americans in Prison. You see at the bottom right of the screen there.
Yes.
And so let's just look at 2009. 2009, the incidence of robbery, so the crimes per 1,000 residents, is lower than the incidence of burglary and the incidence of motor vehicle theft. So burglary and motor vehicle theft are actually more common in their data relative to robbery. But that's not what you see among arrestees and among those who are admitted to prison. So again, 2009, the likelihood of an arrest conditional on committing a robbery is 31%. It's less than half of that for burglary and even lower for motor vehicle theft, 10%. You see in the column, the 2009 column. Look at prison admission per arrest. So even if you're conditional on arrest, 28% prison admission for robbery, which is classified as a violent crime. Somewhat lower, 19% for burglary, and again, much smaller for motor vehicle theft. That is conditional on being arrested, your likelihood of going into prison. So the folks who are committing robbery are heavily overrepresented among arrestees and among prisoners relative to the folks who are committing burglary, motor vehicle theft, and larceny among the pool of offenders committing crimes of appropriation.
How does this relate to stereotypes?
So the stereotypes of criminality are not based on what people are doing. It's based on what we perceive them to be doing or what we observe them to be doing. And the proxy that people use for that is the prison population or the arrestee population. So you don't see the folks committing motor vehicle theft or burglary or larceny at the same rates as you see the people who are committing robbery because they're not arrested. And even
that's that bottom row, the right-hand column, prison admissions per arrest.
Yeah, you need to multiply the prison admissions per arrest with the arrest
per crime.
Yeah, and then you'll get the proportion of people who commit the crime who are actually admitted to prison. And so in this case, it's just 1%.
It's 1%, yeah.
1% for people who commit motor vehicle theft. Now for robbery, it's going to be 28% times 31. So it's about 9 or 10 times as higher. Yeah. So you get this compositional effect. And of course, the folks who commit these crimes whom we don't observe, and that's true with things like cyber crimes. It's true.
So excuse me again, but you're saying robbery will be more salient, I think, in the minds of the public because the consequences of it are more visible in terms of incarceration. But are you yet saying that African Americans will be perceived as more criminal because of something? Because the previous slide.
Yes, I'm saying that, and let me say the latter. And I'm saying that because the association of particular people with criminality or criminal tendencies is related to the racial composition of the incarcerated population. And the racial composition of the incarcerated population reflects robbery much more than it does reflect burglary, motor vehicle theft, and larceny.
But what I'm trying to ask you is, in the previous discussion, you showed that victim selection was affected by race, but you did not, I don't think, show that the level of participation in robbery was affected by racial stereotype.
This was the slide where I did show that. So this is the arrest. So of course, arrest is not a perfect measure of offending, but you can get measures of offending for robbery at least that are not too far. The exact data is in the book, but if you interpret the likelihood of arrest as roughly reflecting the likelihood of commission of a crime, then the racial composition of arrestees you see over here is much higher for robbery than for these other crimes. And if that, that reflects the racial composition of offenders, that makes the point that I was just trying to make.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me move on from robbery and talk about a very different crime, which is homicide. And this is really the only crime that is potentially motivated by preemption. You certainly wouldn't do this for robbery or for anything else that you could imagine. You're not going to do something to somebody just simply because you fear that they will do it to you, except in the case of homicide. There are reasons why people might take somebody's life simply to prevent them from being killed first, which just simply don't apply to other crimes. And as with many things, this is described really nicely in a passage by Thomas Schelling in his book, The Strategy of Conflict. And this is actually, there's quite a lot of depth and sophistication in this passage. And this is sometimes called the burglar paradox. So Schelling says, if I go downstairs to investigate a noise at night with a gun in my hand and find myself face to face with the burglar who has a gun in his hand, there's a danger of an outcome that neither of us desires. Even if he prefers to just leave quietly and I wish him to, there's a danger that he may think I want to shoot and shoot first. Worse, there's a danger that he may think that I think he wants to shoot, or he may think that I think he thinks I want to shoot, and so on. So even reading the passage, one gets a little tangled up in the hierarchy of belief. But Schelling is pointing out that this interaction can break down at various levels. Whether I think he thinks that I think, and so on and so forth. And then he says, and so on. And then he says something that I think is worth thinking about. Self-defense is ambiguous when one is only trying to preclude being shot in self-defense. So the fear that somebody will act in self-defense can cause you to act in self-defense when there's no other reason really for you to do it. And this carries, I think, a lot of content that I think is worth thinking about, especially again when we think about homicide. And I'll get to a couple of I'll explain that comment in just a second. So what this tells us is that when people are living in a climate of fear, so if they're fearful, what does it mean to be living in a climate of fear? If you're living in a neighborhood or in an environment where homicide rates are high, then people are not only going to be fearful, but they will also be aware that other people are fearful. And they'll also be aware that other people are fearful that they are fearful, and so on. So whenever you have an escalating dispute under these conditions, it can result in homicide. Other things equal, it can result in homicide with greater frequency, with greater likelihood, than if the exact same dispute were taking place under circumstances where there wasn't a climate of fear. And this gives you a link between fearsomeness and fearfulness. People who are fearsome, people who inspire fear in others, really ought to be afraid because there's an incentive for others to kill them preemptively. And people who are afraid, who are fearful, are also dangerous for the same reason, right? So there's this link between fearsomeness and fearfulness. And people can be, and there's an expression actually in Ta-Nehisi Coates' memoir, Between the World and Me, and he describes actually growing up in Baltimore that the people around him, the youth especially, were dangerously afraid. And this perfectly captures what I'm trying to say. That if you're afraid, you are going to be dangerous under these circumstances. Now, what makes you afraid? Part of what makes you afraid is that you can be killed with impunity. If you can be pretty sure that somebody who takes your life will be brought to justice, you will know that they're going to think twice before doing it. On the other hand, if you think that you can be killed with impunity, that the crime will remain unsolved, that they will, this person will not suffer consequences from killing you, then that creates stronger incentives for you to kill preemptively. And what this means is that communities where you have low homicide clearance rates, where homicides are left unsolved, they will tend to have also high murder rates. And where they have higher murder rates, that feeds on itself because of this positive feedback effect that Schelling was talking about. The high murder rates themselves entrench and further escalate and further heighten murder rates. Which communities have low murder rates? Well, the Washington Post has an extraordinary data collection exercise on this. And they find that, in the US, a lot of murders go unsolved, but they're not randomly distributed across space and across communities. So there's been a big decline in homicide rates, as from the early 1990s to now.
Indeed.
Across cities in the United States. But with regard to clearance rates, the data in the Washington Post, I think they looked at about 50,000 homicides. Black victims were the least likely of any racial group to have their killings result in an arrest. They're the most likely to be killed with impunity. And if you look at law enforcement sources, who speak about this quite often, because they're confronted with this and ask, well, why aren't you solving these cases? Don't you care about the killing of Black Americans? Their response is that poor relationships with residents make it more difficult to solve homicides. And that, they will often know a killer's identity, but cannot get witnesses to cooperate out of fear of retaliation or mistrust of law enforcement. And so the police view is not that they don't care. I mean, historically, there have certainly been cases extensively documented where police and politicians and those who supervise them really did not care. But the contemporary law enforcement view is that homicide detectives face strong incentives to clear every homicide. But they can't do it because they face a lack of witness cooperation.
May I inform the students, as I'm sure you know, of the excellent book by Jill Leovy called Ghettoside, S-I-D-E, Ghettoside, which is a study of precisely this this issue with homicide detectives in Los Angeles. It's a very, very fine account.
It is. It's an excellent book, and actually, I will mention it myself later.
I beg your pardon.
Quote from her. No. I'm glad this is exactly the right point to raise it. And she makes this point, and I think the way she describes it is and this links to my next point, is that America, in at least many communities in America, are over-policed and under-protected, and these two things go hand in hand. That over-policing with regard to less serious crimes can give rise to the kind of distrust that prevents witnesses coming forward, and so you end up with these same communities being underprotected. I'll come back to this point, but Jill Leovy makes it extremely powerfully using particular examples over a couple of decades in Los Angeles to make this point. Here's a very striking example. So this is from over a decade ago. A 7-year-old girl was shot while riding her bicycle, luckily non-fatally, but there were a very large number of witnesses. So according to this account, at least 20 people were witnesses. None of them came forward. They said that they were looking in a different direction, or they didn't see what was happening, and even the grandmother, who was a witness, she declined to be interviewed, and she said that she would not talk to the police for fear that she would have to move out of the country. So there was a fear of retaliation here that was keeping the witnesses from coming forward, even though this is a very sympathetic victim, a 7-year-old girl on a bicycle. And part of that is the point I'm trying to make, is that part of the victim reluctance to come forward is the understanding that other victims are also, sorry, let me repeat that. Part of the reluctance of witnesses to come forward is linked to the fact that they understand that other witnesses also will not come forward. So it's not just a fear of retaliation, it's also an understanding that nobody's going to come forward and you're going to come forward alone, and you don't want to do that, especially in the face of possible retaliation. So these two things are really important components of trying to understand why you have witness recalcitrance in these kind of cases. But let me link this actually to a very different set of crimes. I'll do that in a second, but you end up in this situation with what we in the book and elsewhere have called collective silence. Witness cooperation, if you think about it, is really an altruistic act. It's a public spirited act. It carries many risks. It carries few private benefits. And your testimony is going to be most effective when it's corroborated. And retaliation will be least likely if many people testify. There's a diffusion of responsibility. And this, some of your students may be aware of, in economics is referred to as strategic complementarity, that the more people testify, the more incentive there is for others to testify. And likewise, silence begets silence. If few testify, that makes it harder for others to testify. And you have, you can have public messages like snitches get stitches that can cause people to coordinate on an equilibrium with silence. And even without any social pressure, not to snitch, there's a first mover disadvantage. The first witness to come forward faces the greatest risk and the greatest possible loss. But once a witness comes forward, you can have floodgates opening, and you can end up with lots and lots and lots of other people then coming forward. It opens the doors for other people to come forward. And I want to illustrate this point by looking at a very different set of crimes. And I want to argue that, we think of, we sort of partition crimes in our minds in certain ways. We associate certain crimes with certain people and certain communities, but they actually have some structural similarities. So let me talk now about crimes where the witness is the only victim. And these are crimes such as sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape. where doubts exist about the existence and the willingness to testify about other victims. Even if you know that there exist a number of other victims, you may worry that they're not going to be willing to come forward.
You don't want to be the first one.
You don't want to be the first. And the best example of this is the Larry Nassar case. The Larry Nassar case, Larry Nassar was described as, by prosecutors as possibly the most prolific serial child sex abuser in history. Yet, over 150 victims, dating back to 1995. Youngest was age 6. I think the earliest was maybe age 10. The victims included 4 Olympic gold medalists. And the first mover, the person who first came forward was a witness by the name of Rachel Denhollander. And she's the first person who came forward and allowed media to use her name. There are other people who come forward anonymously. But she allowed people she came forward under her own name. She came forward in August 2016 without anonymity. And the judge at the sentencing for Larry Nassar described her as the bravest person I've ever had in my courtroom, precisely because of these effects, that there's a very strong, very powerful first mover disadvantage. Because once she came forward, many victims came forward, and she opened the door to that. And a lot of people, I think, will recognize the first mover disadvantage in this situation, but who don't always realize that the very same process is going on with the situation of the lack of witness testimony in the case of the 7-year-old who was shot on a bicycle. There's a very strong first mover disadvantage in both of these situations. There are other cases, the Harvey Weinstein case, Bill Cosby's case, Roger Ailes, Bill O'Reilly.
Yeah.
Many very high profile victims, people who, themselves, very affluent, very famous, people like Angelina Jolie, people like Gwyneth Paltrow. And they were themselves reluctant to come forward. And Lupita Nyong'o in the New York Times in an op-ed, she expressed regret for not having come forward sooner to describe her interactions with Harvey Weinstein. And said she speaks up now, to contribute to the end of the conspiracy of silence. It's really logically very similar to the examples of witnesses remaining quiet when somebody's shot or somebody's killed.
I've just read Ronan Farrow's book.
Yeah.
On this matter. I forget what he calls it now.
I've also forgotten. It just came out very recently. I haven't read it. But
it's extraordinary the length to which Weinstein and some of his colleagues went to discredit the few women who were willing to talk early in the process before it all unraveled.
That's right. That's the point in the last bullet point here. So the first to come forward is going to face intense retaliation to send a message to others not to come forward.
Catch and kill is
catch and kill. Yeah. So that's right. And also, so the other way to deal with it is to have confidential settlements. Non-disclosure agreements. You make a payout. And again, Harvey Weinstein again was responsible for many such settlements. And the idea is, if you can just keep people quiet, the second and third and fourth mover doesn't know there's been a first mover.
Right.
And so they think that they're the first mover. And they face the same challenges that the first movers actually faced. So that gives you the logic of secret settlements, non-disclosure agreements, and massive retaliation for the people who come forward first. Yeah.
And the secrecy is not only to avoid embarrassment to the perpetrator, but also to prevent the full extent of the criminal behavior to become known.
And quite possibly the latter motive is stronger than the former even. Yeah, that's right. So there's the reputational loss, of course, but yeah, the I would say, at least as important is just making sure that nobody feels as if somebody's already come forward. Yeah.
By the way, I want you to know we probably have about 25 minutes left here.
Okay, let me move on then. Yeah. Here's an example from the 1990s. It's become quite relevant now. This is the Anita Hill case, and this is Jane Mayer in a relatively recent interview, who describes how Anita Hill was dragged through the dirt. And this is an example of the kind of retaliation that she had to face. According to Jane Mayer, people accused her accused her of improper behavior. They questioned her motives, suggested that she was an erotomaniac. A woman scorned, there's a famous quote, I think, from Orrin Hatch, whether she had personal motives, professional motives, political motives, questioned her sanity, called her liar, called her lunatic, and essentially effectively prevented other people from speaking up. That's not all that was going on in this case, of course, but certainly she was alone in that case, and the dangers of being alone. At least publicly, she was alone in coming forward, and this what happened to her is illustrated at least by Jane Mayer, I think, who wrote a book on this particular set of events as a lesson for others who might think about coming forward. Okay, let me quickly talk about police stops and then lethal force, and then I'll stop. So we have about, so as I mentioned early on, stereotypes can affect also stops and searches. We've got about 25 million traffic stops, 1.5 million pedestrian stops annually in the US. About 2% of white drivers have their vehicles searched, about 6% of Black and Latino drivers. And stops and searches require what's called reasonable articulable suspicion. So they are permissible. They do not require a stronger standard of probable cause. It's relatively less onerous from the point of view of suspicion. But nevertheless, you can't stop somebody just because they're Black or male or belong to a particular ethnic group. You have to have suspicion that is individual, that specifically speaks to the circumstances that you're confronting, independent of these demographic factors. Demographic factors can play a role. For example, if you've got a police description, let's say, if you've got a description of somebody, you can use that to determine whether or not you should search, but you require individual specific evidence in general. Now, if you just look at the fact that 2% of white drivers have their vehicle searched and 6% of Black and Latino drivers, does that suggest that there's discrimination against Black and Latino drivers? No, it does not. I mean, because it's quite possible that, applying a standard of reasonable articulable suspicion evenly across all people, it may turn out that that a larger number of Black and Latino drivers reasonably arouse suspicion. We don't know based only on this data. This doesn't tell us whether there's discrimination or not. So how can we make that determination? One way to do it is what's called the hit rate test. This is something that was originally proposed, I think, by Gary Becker, and has been the idea developed especially by Ian Ayres. And the idea is basically, you should look at the rates of contraband recovery. If you're applying the same standard of suspicion to all groups, then the likelihood, at least for the marginal individuals, those who are close to the threshold of being searched, should give you a rate of contraband recovery that is independent of their group membership. If you're treating all groups equally, and applying the same standard of threshold suspicion, you should recover contraband at roughly the same rates. And I'll give you some data on this in a second. There are various problems with interpreting contraband recovery rates, because they don't tell you who was marginal, who was on the threshold of being stopped. But leaving that aside for a second, let me just show you what happened. This is with regard to stop and frisks in New York City. Yeah. You had at their peak close to 700,000 stops. Again, this has been in the news with the brief entry of Mike Bloomberg into the nomination contest. So it rose very substantially, and then it's down to tiny fraction of its peak level.
Yeah, I want you to know that we have been reading about stop and frisk a bit. Tracy Mears' article in the Yale Law Journal, for example, on this subject.
Yeah.
So we've had some familiarity with the debate.
So the stop and frisk in New York City stop and frisk, program required police officers to fill out a form in which they identified exactly what aroused their suspicion, right? Because they have to identify and in fact disclose this fact on a form. And so that can then be used to look at contraband recovery rates, because if you stop somebody under suspicion of having a weapon, you can then try to see whether they did in fact have a weapon, and you can calculate the likelihood of getting a weapon from individuals of different groups. And there's a set of computer scientists at Stanford, part of the open policing project, that have done this. And here's a reference to a particular paper. They looked at 3 million stops over 2008 to 2012. 4/5 of those stops involved Black or Latino drivers. The overall hit rate for weapon recovery was about 3%. Most of the weapons were knives. And the hit rate was 2.5 for Black civilians, 3.6 for Latinos, 11% for whites.
Wow.
Now, this is quite a big difference in the hit rates. But again, I want to caution your students not to take this as immediate evidence of discrimination. And that's because these are not marginal hit rates. These are average hit rates. And if they're interested, they can look at the book for details as to why this distinction matters. But what they do in this paper is try to actually compute the marginal hit rates, to try to actually see whether or not you can predict the likelihood of recovering a weapon. And they find that the likelihood of weapon recovery is predictably low for Black and Latino pedestrians in the stop and frisk program relative to whites. And they claim that about half the weapons could be recovered with about 6% of stops, and that a disproportionate share of the least productive stops involve searches of Black civilians. And so they conclude that optimizing for weapon recovery would simultaneously bring more racial balance. So if you were to drastically scale down the number of stops, you'd get both more racial balance, and you'd end up, if you actually did so in a way that just excluded the least productive stops. So in fact, if you move towards the probable cause threshold, which is what we've done now in New York, if you allowed people to search somebody only, if they met a higher standard of suspicion, you'd end up recovering most of these weapons, and you'd end up with more racial balance.
Well, let me ask you about that. What about deterrence? What about the idea, if I belong to a population group, if there is a population group in which the number of weapons is high, and it has been singled out for disproportionate stopping, that the incentive to not carry the weapon in the first place will depress the number of observed people on the street with the weapon, and hence the stop hit rate will be lower. But the effect of the policy might have been to cause the stop hit rate to be low precisely by deterring people from carrying the weapon in the first place. And if weapon possession or proclivity to carry varies across demographic groups in the population, could this deterrent effect difference across those groups not justify stopping, even if the hit rate did not justify the stopping?
Well, certainly not at the margin, right? I mean, it just, you might say that you want to move towards more equalization of these hit rates, but maybe not go all the way if there's large differences across groups in weapon possession. But
I'm asking whether the endogeneity of carrying alters the interpretation of marginal hit rate comparisons across groups, or average hit rate comparisons across the endogeneity of carrying.
I understand your question. I think it does. Yeah, I think it does, and it's worth thinking about. This is an argument that's made, to justify the policy. You've interviewed Heather McDonald on your show, on your Blogging Heads show, and I think she would make this argument. But my point is that, if you were to move towards a probable cause standard, will then start to carry weapons more often with them because they're being stopped at lower rates. As long as you're able to identify those under the stronger threshold of suspicion, you're still stopping people. You're not stopping people. You're not abstaining from stopping people. It's just that you're applying a different standard of suspicion, and your standard of suspicion itself has to be endogenous to this effect that you're describing. But I don't think it undermines the general argument. I think it just means that it's a bit more subtle and more complicated than simply acting under the assumption that weapons possession is independent of the policy in force. So your point is taken, yeah, but I don't think it undermines the general point here.
Okay.
Okay. So how much time do I have? Like 5 or 10 minutes, or not?
Yeah, 5 or 10 minutes, I'd say.
Okay, let me move quickly then. So another reason why you have distrust. So remember that, you know, in the case of the low homicide clearance rate, one of the reasons cited was distrust of law enforcement. And here, you know, an example is in this Department of Justice report on the Ferguson Police Department,
Yeah.
which is not unusual. There are many departments that have relied on citations by police officers for revenue generation to meet the needs of local expenditures, because the other alternative is to raise taxes, which is unpopular, and so people have treated it a bit like a funding source, law enforcement as a funding source for municipal governments. And so this Department of Justice report found a pattern of stops without reasonable suspicion, arrests without probable cause, excessive force, unnecessarily aggressive, and at times unlawful policing, which, you know, the last sentence here, law enforcement is seen as illegitimate, and the partnerships necessary for public safety are in some areas entirely absent. And this sort of it goes some way towards explaining why somebody is going to be reluctant to come forward as a witness. And there's a separate Department of Justice report on the killing of Michael Brown by Darren Wilson, where, you know, so the same Department of Justice, this is, you know, helmed by Eric Holder at the time, you know, came to the conclusion that the Ferguson Police Department routine practices were highly discriminatory and in fact unlawful. Also came to the conclusion that there was that there were witnesses in the Michael Brown case who were very, very reluctant to provide testimony that was consistent with the white police officers in that case. And they felt intense pressure.
Even though the Justice Department did indeed find that the white police officer's shooting of Michael Brown was justified.
Yeah, exactly. So they list a whole bunch of, the reason why the Justice Department found it to be justified in that report, the reason why they did was because they found that those who provided testimony that contradicted the officer were not themselves credible. They retracted their testimony, or they were found to have inconsistencies with their testimony. But what you see in this report is precisely this effect playing out, where people are very, very reluctant. There's the extreme, you know, severe community pressure to
So
testify
the irony,
in some ways, and not
it's
in others.
ironic, is it not, that Officer Wilson might have had a better defense against the charge that he abused his authority if the Ferguson Police Department had been seen in better light by the residents of Florissant Avenue housing projects.
That's my point. That's my point.
Yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right to point that out. That's my point. And it has bigger implications than that, because routine homicides are not going to be solved because people just don't want to interact with the police department that behaves in this way. You're right. But I would suggest, you know, that, you know, if anyone in your class is interested, or they, you know, work on a senior thesis or want to go deeper into this, that they read both these reports, because they look at two very different sides of Ferguson, and that are linked together but not in obvious ways. And it's fascinating. These two reports are just fascinating, and they're not, you know, they're quite long, but you know, easy reading, relatively straightforward. So let me move on, because I don't have much time. You know, this is just another example. I don't want to belabor the point, but this is Tim Scott. You know, it's one of the most conservative members of Congress in terms of his voting record on most issues, I would say.
Yeah.
I think he voted present on the stimulus bill, or against, you know, even the recent.
Oh my!
I think so. I need to verify that, but you know, Tim Scott is you know, authentically
conservative Republican from the state of South
Carolina. Republican, there's no doubt about it. But on the issue of being stereotyped and stopped, you know, he gave a very emotional speech. It's on YouTube, 7 minutes long, on the floor of the Senate, describing how he'd just been stopped, you know, from entering the Senate offices, even though he had the pin. And he says there's absolutely nothing more frustrating, more damaging to your soul than when you know you're following the rules and being treated like you're not. And this, again, you know, just to reinforce the point that this kind of behavior is going to alienate innocence. And if you think back to the New York stop and frisk, weapon recovery stops actually succeeded in recovering weapons only in 3% of cases. So 97% were people stopped under suspicion of having weapons who didn't have them. Now, you pointed out that maybe they had them at home or somewhere else. Right. But nevertheless, there are going to be a large number of people in Tim Scott's position where they feel like they were just, you know, mistreated by the system, or mistreated by the law enforcement community. And that's going to affect their willingness to come forward as witnesses. Okay, so should I talk about lethal force, or are we running out of time? It's not on the reading.
Why don't I tell you that we've read the JPE paper of Fryer on
Oh, I
use
see.
of force,
So tell me.
and I've also shared with the students your blog post in which you offered some critical reactions to that research
Yeah.
project.
Tell
So
me.
if there were some things that you wanted to say in that spirit, that would be fine for the last 5 minutes or so.
Okay, yeah, 5 minutes is all I need. I just want to point out, because this is work that I'm doing now with Daniel Flaherty, follow up to this book on the geography of lethal force in the United States. And if things work out, I should be at the Radcliffe Institute next year, working pretty much full time on this follow-up project. And basically what Dan and I found, was there's incredible differences across space in the use of lethal force. So let me just go through. This is data from The Guardian, which shows about 1,100 police killings a year in the United States, much, much higher than in other countries of comparable levels of prosperity. And I just want to, I'll just skip through a lot of what's in the book. They can see it. But I just want to show you a couple of things about the geography of lethal force, and then I'll stop. This is from The Guardian data. This is the likelihood of being killed. So this is the proportion of people killed per million population across different demographic groups. And
killed by police.
Killed by police, yeah. They may be justified or unjustified killings,
Yeah.
Leave that to one side. That issue is discussed at length in our chapter on lethal force. But I just want you to take a look over here. And if you look at within cities, so if you read down columns, so you look at Los Angeles, likelihood of being killed if you're black is about 15 per million. The proportion of people who are police homicide victims is 15 for black Angelenos, 7.6 for Hispanics, and 2.3 for whites. So you get these racial disparities within cities, so within Los Angeles. Look at New York, the scale is much lower, but the disparities are still there. Look at Chicago, the scale is low, intermediate, but you see the disparities. Same with Houston, same with Philadelphia. As you read down the columns, you see that you're more likely to be killed if you're black than if you're Latino, and you're more likely to be killed if you're Latino than if you're white within cities. But look at the difference in scale across cities. So if you look at the bottom row for Houston, you see that if you're white in Houston, your likelihood of being killed is 3.7 per million, which is greater than the likelihood of being killed by police in New York City if you're black. That's the 3.4, the top column in the column associated with New York City. Yeah. So the scale differences across the country are so large that they sometimes even swamp out the fact that you have got these disparities within cities. And this means two things. Firstly, that if you have studies that are based on the West, like Houston or Los Angeles, you ought to be very careful with regard to generalization. And this is one of the points I made actually with regard to Fryer's article, which relies quite heavily on data from Houston.
Yes.
And whites in Houston are at considerable risk, more so than African Americans in New York City. The second point here is that if you were to just look at the country as a whole, which again, many people have done, right? If you just look at the racial disparities in the country as a whole, you could have racial disparities in exposure to police homicides within every city, but at the same time, you don't see it in the national data if you aggregate. There's something called Simpson's paradox. So for example, if and I'm not saying this is true, but as a thought experiment, if most whites lived in Houston and most African Americans lived in New York City, and you were to think of Houston and New York City combined as being, let's say, a little country, right? Yeah. You'd find that in this country, African Americans were at lower risk than whites. If you just added the two things together, because the white rate would be close to 3.7, black rate would be close to 3.4. But within each component of this country, so to speak, you'd find significant disparity. So there's problems with aggregation that arise when there's such differences in scale. That's just something for your students to think about. Yeah. And the differences in scale are systematic. So what you see in this table, and this is the last figure I'll show you, and then I'm going to stop. This shows you differences across states in the Guardian data, and the green here represents the northeastern states. So, wow. The least exposure is Connecticut. But all the New England states, as well as New York, Philadelphia, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey are on the low end of police homicide exposure. The yellow is the Midwest, the brown is the South, and the red is the West. And the Western states, really, the places where you have the largest amount of police homicides, are really in the west of the country. And why this is, what's going on over here is something we're looking at now. It's not easy to explain on simply on the dangers that officers themselves face, or even on gun prevalence, or even on the degree of violent crime. These factors don't account for these kind of geographic differences. And we're thinking that it has something to do with leadership and organizational culture and, and recruitment and training. But we haven't solved this yet. And this is one of the major projects that I'm working on right now. So I am going to stop. I'm out of town. I'm out of time anyway. Here's a summary of the argument. I can give you my slides to post if you like.
Oh yeah, please do forward them over.
But I
see
just want to point.
You're citing Loury here.
Yeah, I'll send you my slides to post. And here at the bottom is Jill Leovy's quotation. I didn't remember it quite right, but here it is. American criminal justice is at once oppressive and inadequate. And that book is really worth reading also for your students. Finally, let's go back to Walter Lippmann, because he writes so beautifully. And he talks about stereotypes being a cognitive necessity, just like other psychologists have done. And he says erroneous generality and hostility are natural and common capacities of the human mind. So what should we do about them? He says that we can't get rid of our stereotypes, but we can hold them lightly and modify them gladly. And I just really like to I like to end with this, because it's something that people can reflect on with regard to their own stereotypes.
An aspiration devoutly to be wished.
Yeah. And finally, there's a YouTube video that goes through essentially the same set of slides based on a Santa Fe Institute community lecture, which people can find easily on YouTube. And I will send you these slides in any case. So I'll stop right there unless there's something you want to discuss further.
No, only to thank you very, very much for giving us your time and for your excellent presentation.